Hi, guys. Well, how has everybody's week been going? First and foremost, everyone, happy Wednesday. Cheers. And let's all take a nice sip to enjoy. So I realized I was really negligent this week, and I'm sure you all are fine with it because you're perfectly capable of choosing wines on your own, but I wasn't sure what I was going to drink this week. So I didn't have it posted. And then I decided today that I was going to go ahead and drink this, which is, so this is a really beautiful, it's Chateau de Rouen, and it's a Vin Sobro. So this is actually from the Southern Rhone. It's a blend of Grenache, Mourvedre, and Syrah. So it's a pretty classic, but Vin Sobro is a cru of the Southern Rhone. And this is Southern Rhones are kind of my jam. I do love them. I definitely got that from Nancy, for anyone who knows Nancy, but also who just knows the Southern Rhone. They're just pretty beautiful, epic wines. But I also thought it was really appropriate because it does have some very unique aromatic characteristics, but all wines do. And so I have to say, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but today's was very much I was super excited to do this because I find aroma in wine fascinating. And anyone who may have taken, oh, how could you not, right? But it's one of these rabbit holes that I definitely can fall into very easily. So I was realizing as I was putting this together, I was like, there is so much more than anyone who should think about that I can even think about for this. So there's a lot going on for sure. So today's webinar, I was realizing how epic it is and how much there is probably that I'm not going to cover, and I'm going to gloss over a lot of this. But if we find things super interesting at some point, we'll probably revisit it in smaller, minute details and formats. This is how I'm learning. This is the beauty of all of this, which is really funny. So as I was saying, I find this to be a super amazing and fascinating concept because there are I just feel like it's obvious, right? It's impossible to really, a couple things. It's impossible to dive completely into this topic because it's epically dense, first of all. And then B, the amazing thing about aroma is that it's so unique and individual to every single person. So I always struggled with this when I was starting to learn about wine. I was very daunted by the idea of tasting wine because you have these very dramatic and very specific descriptors, and you wonder where people came up with them. And if anyone's seen the movie Somm, of course, there's that whole rubber garden hose kind of descriptor. There's tar, there's dirt, mushrooms, truffles, things that have no place necessarily in wine itself when you think about a beverage that is derived from grapes. But of course, as we all know, as appreciators of wine, whenever you pour something in your glass, it's completely different. And the first thing you do is smell it, because smell is pretty much the main component of everything we taste. And so for something to be so complex and so individual, and also when we're talking about wine, to be really unregulated, there's no standard, because there's no way to prove that what I'm smelling is the same thing as what you're smelling. And that's the mystery about it. But the beauty is that it doesn't have to be pretentious, and it's not pretentious. It is just about understanding your own sense of smell and really just committing to whatever that aroma invokes in you. And today we're going to talk about the geeky specific stuff about it, a little bit more into kind of like the science behind it, very little into that, because like I said, it's a rabbit hole and I could go on for hours, but we only have so much time. So when we're talking about aroma in wine, roughly, I think the average is around 80% of everything that we taste of flavor is actually derived from what we smell. So anyone who's had a cold before, you know that it's hard to taste things when you have a cold because you can no longer smell things. But in the weird scientific sense of it, just as a quick overview, the human brain senses flavors through the olfactory bulb, and the olfactory bulb is reached basically through the nostrils and then also through the retronasal cavity in the back of your mouth. So you do get some flavor and aroma from the taste, but most of it comes in through your nose. And then it's amazing because to get to the olfactory bulb, you have all of these olfactory sensors that basically are each individual, thousands and thousands of these individual olfactory sensors that each are attuned to only a small range of scents and aromas. So it's all of these different olfactory sensors working together to get that information to your olfactory bulb, which then sends the information to your brain, and then your brain creates something that you can identify, which again, might be completely different from what I identify it as. And additionally, you can also have a very specific, as everyone I think is also very aware, aroma is one of the most sort of volatile emotional sensory factors that we have. You can smell something and immediately be transported to a memory, to a place, to a time. And so all of those emotional factors, they interact with what you're actually smelling in your glass as well, and which is partially why wine has such an emotional component to it, and food too. We have these very emotional reactions to smell. So when we're talking about the actual aroma in wine, we're talking about the fact that what we're smelling are chemical reactions of different chemical compounds. And one of the words you may hear thrown around a bit are esters. And esters are actual chemical compounds that are formed by a reaction between acids and alcohols, which are two of the main components of wine. And so esters are chemical compounds that tend to have a fruity smell to them. And these are the building blocks essentially of what we smell, of all the different flavor compounds that we are actually the aroma compounds that we smell. And most commonly, these esters are derived from either fermentation or aging. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And the interesting thing about esters and flavor compounds is that much more of the wine is actually based on things that we cannot smell or taste. So first of all, the actual things that we smell, these aromatic volatile compounds, only make up 0.5% of what's actually in the bottle. The majority of what's in your bottle, to be perfectly honest, is water. And so you're looking at about like 75 to 85%. Well, let's not say 75%, but like 85 to 87% water. Because if you think about that, the majority, pretty much the remainder of that is going to be your alcohol. So let's say you have a 15% alcohol wine, then you're looking at roughly around 85% water. I mean, you know, give or take a little bit, because again, we have these volatile aromatic compounds. We have acids, which we taste, which are part of the sensory experience, and other kind of smaller percentages of various components that make up what's actually in the bottle. But majorly, it is water, alcohol, and then, you know, these other compounds that we smell and taste and create so much of the experience of how we associate with wine, which is really, really fascinating. These compounds react and also kind of decompose, if you will, at different rates based on what the individual components are, how hot it is, all sorts of various environmental factors. So that's partially why each different wine is unique, because the way that the chemical reactions take place, the way that they're formed, and the way that they essentially evolve and then degenerate is different based on so many different factors. So that's why you can have the same wine with even the same sort of chemical components in it and chemical compounds and reactions happening at different rates, creating different wine experiences, which is totally crazy, right? So, but to break it down into a much more digestible conversation, one thing I want to introduce is just this idea of grouping. So we're going to get a little general, but we're definitely going to put things in groups today. And one of the first things I like to put up is this idea of primary, secondary, and tertiary aromas. So we're going to talk a little bit about where aromas come from, but these are your basic categories. And if you think about it, primary aromas are aromas that are going to be derived essentially kind of from the grape itself. So that's your kind of your initial and most important indicator of aroma is what grape are you using? What grape is the wine being made of? Secondary aromas are aromas that are developed during the process of winemaking. So this is anything that happens basically to the grape after it's brought to the winery and up to the point that it's put in the bottle. And then finally, you have tertiary aromas. And tertiary aromas are aromas that develop over time as the wine ages in the bottle. So looking at these three categories, it's a good way to kind of cluster, if you will, your different sensory aroma experiences into where they might be coming from. Cool, moving on. So where does aroma come from? What affects aroma? So I have this broken down basically into two categories. In the top, you can see in the green, we have grape, terroir, and climate. And I'm talking, I'll reference to these as kind of like your outside factors in terms of they're actually outside of the winery. They're in the vineyard. So aroma obviously develops with the grape itself, and different things will impact that based on a variety of things that we'll talk about. And then you have what happens basically in the winery, which is going to be fermentation, winemaking, maturation. So that's basically the aging process that happens after fermentation at the winery. And then development, which is the, as we kind of talked about with those tertiary aromas, the development that happens after the wine is put into a bottle and then sent out to market. So things like when you're aging wines, the aromas that develop there, the development of that. When we talk about tasting, we are obviously focused a lot on aroma, because when you are tasting either just for pleasure or for studying, pretty much most of your information about the wine itself is going to come from the aroma and from the smells that you're getting. So being as specific as possible with that and understanding that as best as you can is going to help improve your ability to taste and evaluate wine. And so it's just a really, really good process to kind of get a nice understanding of where all this is coming from and what you can do with it and why it matters. So we're going to start off with in the vineyard, and it may seem pretty self-explanatory, but I'll go over it anyway. Your primary origin of aroma is going to come from the grape. So this is what we're talking about, varietal. Varietal means Chardonnay, Syrah, Cabernet Sauvignon, Malbec, the names of the grapes that wines are made from. These varietals each have, regardless of where they're grown, individual varietals will have what we call varietal markers. And these will be unique aromatic signatures that should be present in the grape no matter where it's grown or how it's made. So this is how you can say, you know, you can always kind of know that a Sauvignon Blanc is a Sauvignon Blanc because there are certain smells that you get no matter where that Sauvignon Blanc is made or who made it. And these are what we call, again, varietal markers, and these are inherent in the grape naturally from the very beginning. So that being said, all of the aroma and flavor in a grape develops as the vine produces the grape. So it develops in the skins themselves. The skins hold a lot of those flavonoid compounds and those aromatic compounds that are eventually released. And of course, the juice, which is mostly water, but also within the grape itself contains the sugars and also flavor and aroma compounds. So all of those combined together are what are going to be the origin factors for aroma and flavor. And then we do move into where is that grape being grown, the terroir. Why is terroir important? I mean, there's so many reasons, and it's such still a divisive subject, but terroir, regardless of how you'd like to think about it, not as a pretentious thing, but simply as the idea of what is the exact land that this grape is being grown on, and how does that contribute to the development of the grape itself. So that goes into things. If you were in the terroir webinar a while back, you'll be a little bit more familiar with this, but the terroir is things like soil. And it's not just about like the composition of the soil, but that's a part of it. So what is that soil made of? How old is it? How nutritious is it? Because if it's very nutrient rich, it might mean that the vine will be more vigorous and produce more grapes, which might lend a different ratio of aroma development and aroma compound developments in the skins and the juice. Same thing with terrain. When you think about terrain, it's like, is it hilly? How steep is the slope? What direction is that slope facing in order to maximize sun exposure? All of these things really have to do with how well that grape has the ability to ripen, because the ability for that grape to ripen to perfect peakness is what you want to create the perfect amount of highly concentrated aromatic compounds, right? So basically, the better your grape grows, the better quality aroma and flavor it's going to have. And the terroir will influence the ability for that grape to, or the vine to produce good grapes. And then another interesting factor that is part of terroir, but not quite as much about ripening the grapes, is the idea of local vegetation. And I find this one to be very fascinating, part of why I have my lovely little Rhone varietal over here, because it's the idea of wherever your grape is being grown, there are going to be other ambient particles, plants mostly, and these elements can contribute and actually influence the flavor of the wine. So if you think about it, in the Southern Rhone, we have something called kind of garrigue, and this is an herbal scrub that will just exist naturally in the environment and on the terrain. And this can be kind of like a thyme or, you know, herbs, again, some herbaceous qualities. And the thing is, if you think about it, you have winds that pick up, it's all in the same environment, which means that individual minute microscopic particles from this garrigue might be carried across the air into the vineyard and will land on the grape itself. And the grape has, each grape, every grape has this bloom that you can't really see, but it's kind of a little sticky if you think about it. And on this bloom, these other little particles from other plants might get stuck, so that when those grapes eventually go into the winery, the elements, including the aromatic elements of these sort of local vegetation that's around the vineyard, might contribute to the aroma and flavor of the wines. So if anyone else has kind of a Rhone or a something grown in the Southern Rhone in France, you might notice a little bit of this thyme and herbal note, and that's very common, and that can be really helpful in a blind tasting, because these kind of outside factors can help you as a taster kind of think about and identify where that wine might have been grown, which is super, super interesting. So local vegetation, I think, is really, really. Another example is in Australia. There's a lot of, in various areas, there's sometimes a high concentration of eucalyptus that's grown in Australia. And so you'll hear sometimes Cabernets from Australia having a eucalyptal quality as an identifying factor. And that is because that ambient kind of aroma is coming from what has been grown around the vineyard naturally. And then also in the vineyard, of course, is climate. And climate, again, this goes back to the ability for that grape to ripen appropriately and to its fullest potential. This is important for the ability for that grape to ripen, and also for the ability for all those phenolics and flavor and aroma compounds to ripen fully as well. So temperature, is the climate cool? Is it warm? How long does it take for that grape to ripen? Because in most cases, the longer the ripening period for the grape, the more complex and concentrated flavors and aromas will be developing in the grape. So it tends to be more favorable to have a longer growing season, as opposed to grapes that are ripened very quickly in hot climates because it's not natural for their particular varietal. Sometimes they don't have as much time to develop the maximum aroma and flavor potential. So temperature is a huge factor. Same thing with sunshine. Some grapes need more sun, just actual sunlight, regardless of heat, in order to ripen fully. And then water. This is mostly kind of, when I think about it in terms of irrigation, because sometimes wherever you're growing your grape has plenty of water naturally from rain. And if it doesn't, you might need to irrigate so your grapes don't die. Or you might be irrigating to increase quantity. And of course, by irrigating to increase quantity, you're usually diluting the actual flavor potential of the grapes that go into the wine. So water use is part of the climate, and that contributes to the eventual development of aroma and flavor in your wine. So now we've been in the vineyard, we're gonna take those grapes and we're gonna bring them to the winery. And in the winery, there's a whole slew of new factors that are going to influence and contribute to the various aromas and flavors that come out in the wine. And most specifically, really, really at the top of the list is fermentation. And this kind of is the magic moment. So we have all this natural potential in the grapes themselves for natural aroma and flavor compounds specific to the grape varietal and from the vineyard, right? But then once you bring those grapes in there, you have to turn that grape juice into alcohol, and you do that via fermentation with yeast. So really quick review: yeast eats sugar, excretes alcohol, carbon dioxide, and heat. That's the basic formula, if you will, for creating wine. But it's important to know that fermentation is not 100% efficient. So that explanation is not equal to 100% of what happens. There is, while that process is going on, there's all sorts of byproducts that individual yeasts will create. And the main yeast that is used for wine fermentation is a strain called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. This is the historic yeast. Pretty much all yeast that is used to make wine is part of the Saccharomyces cerevisiae family. However, within that family, there are countless different varieties of strains that are kind of subcategories. And each of those individual strains will produce different byproducts. And all of those different byproducts will react differently with the other chemical compounds that are naturally in wine. Do you see where this starts to just like spiral out? It becomes epically just endless in terms of the possibilities of these chemical reactions. So bringing it back to reality a little bit, what that means is that your yeast is kind of the main avenue for releasing potential aromas and flavors into the wine. Now, the yeast itself is going to be an important choice that the winemaker makes, the very first choice really, in terms of creating the wine that they want. So there are two different roughly kinds of yeast. There's the ambient yeast, and these are the yeasts that naturally occur on the grapes themselves in the vineyard. So there's a lot of winemakers that will talk about natural, especially when we're talking about natural winemaking. These winemakers take those grapes from the vineyard, they put them in the winery, and they pretty much don't touch them. They let whatever yeast is naturally occurring on the grape itself to ferment the wine and create all those ancillary aromas and flavors. So what's the benefit of this? First of all, perfectly natural. And this is the philosophy of let the wine make the wine. Now, where is this most useful and beneficial? This is going to be in places where wine has been grown and basically made for hundreds and hundreds of years. So when you're talking about France, you're talking about Italy, you're talking about Spain, individual locations that have been making the same wine for centuries are going to have a consistent yeast population that they know and that they understand and pretty much is consistent with its outcome. Does that make sense? So you have your ambient yeasts, which have been around for hundreds of years, and you pretty much know what it's going to do because that's what it is. Sorry, I'm looking at a question right now. Bees pollinating carry different pollen help. Well, I think part of that would be bees pollinating would be a pretty small, a small factor in terms of a full vineyard, but because you don't actually need to pollinate vines in order to make them grow, they actually self-pollinate. They're hermaphroditic. So bees aren't needed for the pollination of grapes. So there would be bees around, and often that's part of a biodynamic source. But yes, they can carry other factors around. It just, the amount of them needed in order to transport flavors from one area of ambient areas to the other would be pretty dramatic, but they do it just like the wind does. So any kind of influence and interaction between the vineyard itself and other parts of the surrounding area would contribute to that. But getting back really quickly to natural yeasts, you have this opportunity to basically exploit the grape for what it is and use what's already on there to ferment the wines. Now, where is this difficult? Those yeasts can be unpredictable if you're not that familiar with them. And yeasts are very sensitive. So they can produce off flavors if you're not familiar with the particular yeast of your natural area. And you might start fermenting the grapes and you could end up with this kind of sour tasting or like weird flavors that are a natural byproduct of those kind of ancillary chemical reactions produced by those specific yeast strains. Also, another reason that ambient yeast might be challenging is that, and this comes into the next part, which is temperature, is that yeast can be very fickle. They need a very specific they need good food, they need the right kind of warmth in order to continue to churn that sugar into alcohol. So your yeast might suddenly, if you don't know the yeast very well, it might suddenly stop fermenting in the middle of your fermentation. And then you're left with a bunch of slightly alcoholic sugar grape juice, and you can't get those yeast jump started again, and you're with you end up with a stuck fermentation, which is every winemaker's nightmare. And so the less familiar you are with the yeasts, the more that is a possibility that you could end up with. So how to counter that is the idea of using cultured yeasts. This is very, very typical and very, very common. A lot of winemakers will choose to essentially, you can kill off the natural yeasts by using a little bit of sulfur dioxide, and then you inoculate your must, your grape juice, with cultured yeasts. And you can buy these yeasts. There's a whole catalog that winemakers get to peruse. They can look through the catalog. They'd be like, ooh, this yeast produces banana and coconut flavors. That sounds like what I want in my Chardonnay. I'm gonna buy that one and I'm gonna use it in my Chard. They can do that. So it gets that specific where these individual yeast strains are isolated, identified for specific characteristics, which also might be fermenting in high alcohol, or fermenting in high sugar, sugar density, things like that. So an individual winemaker can sort of control the fermentation by choosing specific cultivated yeasts. They can also get individual yeast cultures basically made for them based on natural ambient yeasts, but without other ancillary yeasts, right? So they might identify a particular strain that they like, send it out to the lab, have that lab recreate and cultivate that individual yeast so that they can just use that one and not also have to deal with other yeasts that might be around there. So that's part of it too. We've got the idea also of temperature and fermentation, and temperature is kind of an important factor. This goes back to the sensitivity of the yeasts. So if it's too hot or too cold, they might stop fermenting. So you need to be careful of that with stuck fermentation, but it also involves the time that the yeast takes to ferment the juice. And the same idea that the longer it takes the grape to develop through its ripening process, the more concentrated and complex those flavors can be. The same thing happens with fermentation. So fermentation happens more slowly in cooler temperatures. It happens more rapidly in hotter temperatures, and you get more extraction in hotter temperatures and a little bit less extraction from cooler temperatures. So as a winemaker, you have a lot of play in the temperature of your fermentation to decide how much flavor, aroma, and phenolic attributes you are extracting from that must during fermentation. I know that's a lot of techie stuff, but it's really super interesting. We could go on for hours, but I won't, I promise. All right, next step in the winery, you have the idea of winemaking processes that also can add aroma to it. One of the most common ones is malolactic fermentation. Who's heard of it? Who knows malolactic fermentation, MLF? So this one, it's gotten a pretty bad rap because mostly MLF, malolactic fermentation, is identified with that smell and taste of butter. So has anyone ever had a very, very, very buttery Chardonnay that kind of tastes like buttered popcorn on sourdough bread and like drinking like melted butter? That is the result of malolactic fermentation. It is technically a component called diacetyl. Yes, MLF, not to be confused with MILF. So diacetyl is kind of the aroma and flavor of butter. And the actual process of malolactic fermentation, the name is deceiving because it's not fermentation. It's actually a conversion that is catalyzed by bacteria. And basically you have lactic bacteria that takes natural malic acid that exists in the wine. And malic acid is that tart flavor that you get like when you're biting into a green apple and it's super sour and it kind of makes you pucker. That very, very tart acid is malic acid. And that exists naturally in grapes. And the process of malolactic conversion is essentially lactic acid taking that malic acid and then converting it into lactic acid, which is that kind of acid that you find in milk, which is softer, less intense, and a little bit creamier in texture. And what is interesting that most people don't know is that malolactic fermentation happens in pretty much all wine. It happens in almost all red wines and in a lot of white wines. And it's a natural process. And it oftentimes is very desirable because it helps to kind of reduce the acidity and add complexity and mouthfeel to the wines, including red wines. But at the same time, in certain white wines and in red wines too, but mostly it's more noticeable in those white wines, if that process creates too much diacetyl, that buttery flavor, it can be really overwhelming and overpowering. So that's where, as a winemaker, you have to be very careful about monitoring your malolactic fermentation. At the same time, as a winemaker, you can also suppress malolactic fermentation if you don't want it to happen. If you have an aromatic varietal like a Riesling or a Gewürztraminer or something that's not going to benefit from losing acidity and getting that buttery kind of creamy mouthfeel, then you would suppress malolactic fermentation by essentially straining out those bacteria, which is a very common process as well. Lees aging is another winemaking component that can create aroma and flavor. Lees are the dead yeast cells that kind of fall to the bottom of a fermentation vessel. And lees, these dead yeast cells go through a process called autolysis, which is essentially the yeast cells breaking down and then they reintegrate into the wine itself. This is also a very common process that adds texture and complexity to wines. And it also releases these sort of bready yeast aromas as well. If you're not quite familiar with what I'm talking about, but you love champagne, that is exactly what it is. It is that kind of nutty, brioche quality that is typical of champagne or traditional method sparkling wines, because the lees aging is part of that process. And to enhance that, people might do something called stirring the lees, which is essentially basically mixing it all up into the fermenting wine and allowing it to integrate more actively. Maturation, so this is getting into that kind of the dual components that we talked about earlier. Maturation is the idea of once the wine is done fermenting, in the winery, what do you do with it? Do you put it in oak? If you're putting it in oak, what you're doing is allowing it to mature with oxygen, because oak as a natural substance allows a little bit of oxygen to come through the barrel, and even though it's watertight, it's not airtight, and integrate with the wine. The bigger the barrel, the less oxygen interaction. The smaller the barrel, the more oxygen interaction. And this basically is oxygen is, it's a catalyst for oxidation. And that is basically creating more chemical reactions in the wine, which are releasing more aromas and increasing sort of complexity and flavor. Now, oak also can impart its aromas and flavors from the natural byproducts of the oak itself. If they toast the oak barrels, that can release more aroma and flavor into the wine. Neutral oak barrels will not impart flavor and aroma, but will still allow oxygen to ingress into the wine. Then you have inert vessels, which are things like stainless steel or epoxy-lined cement. And the idea of these vessels is that they are airtight. They do not allow oxygen to interact with the wine. So essentially, it's preserving the wine and its freshness and fruitiness from just after fermentation. And this is the type of maturation that's used most commonly for wines that are meant to be drunk young and youthful. There is the idea then, after you've matured the wine, of course, it goes into that bottle, and then it goes out to market. And during that process is where you have a whole slew of more chemical reactions that happen, because that wine is never stopping. It is continuously developing. There are constantly chemical reactions happening, releasing more aromas and flavors, and the development continues within that bottle. Bourbon barrels, yes, exactly. So bourbon barrels, which we'll talk about in the next slide too, are the typical kind of example of what you get from flavor and aroma from barrels. That you can find that in wine as well. So moving into a few more fun individual components of aroma, there are tons and tons of different geeky scientific names for these things. And honestly, I just simply can't even put them all in my brain, but I wanted to list out a couple of the most typical ones that we use in association with wine tasting. So methoxypyrazines are flavor compounds that result in herbaceousness. There is, yes, amphoras, that's another, yes, that is also a vessel that does allow a little bit of oxygen in there, but does not impart wood. So good old clay amphoras, things like that, allow for oxidation, but not the flavor from oak. So flavor compounds, methoxypyrazines are what the name for the flavor compounds that you get kind of herbaceous notes from. So things like green bell pepper that you taste in and smell in Cabernet Sauvignon and Sauvignon Blanc. These are two wines that are very typically high in pyrazines or methoxypyrazines. It partially comes from the nitrogen that is a natural component of these compounds. And it can be very, very dominating. It can be very green peppery, or it can also have kind of like an earthy, asparagus-y note too. So it can be kind of both pleasing and also not so pleasing, but those are all in the same kind of category. Terpenes are another very, very common aroma compound that are members of a group called terpenoids. So monoterpenes are terpenes, and individual monoterpenes contribute to kind of like that floral note that you get with Rieslings and Muscats, and very typically almost in all wines, you'll have some sort of floral component, red or white. And part of that reason is because there are tons of terpenes. There are more than 40 individual terpene compounds that have been identified. So if you can kind of contribute to that all in the various iterations they have in quite a wide variety of wines, there's just so many of them, and they're very omnipresent. But they tend to be very pleasing, and again, very aromatic in the floral note. Then you have mercaptans, and also known as thiol compounds. But kind of there's a dichotomy there, because mercaptans are not generally considered to be pleasant or ideal in wine. They tend to be foul smelling, and they have a sulfurous kind of quality to them. So if you ever open a bottle of wine and kind of smell like rotten eggs, it's usually an overconcentration of mercaptans. Oftentimes this can just be blown off. So you hear about kind of like swirling the wine to let it blow off. These are allowing the mercaptans to release and kind of dissipate in the air. But sometimes they're just too dominant, and they can kind of infiltrate the wine, and that can create like a sour sensation and a foulness in the wine. But there's also sort of volatile thiols in small amounts that are very, very pleasant and very, very complex. And these are the kind of compounds that give you kind of like this earthy, fruity aroma with passion fruit, or like a guava, or that gooseberry kind of like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc-y note that's just on the verge of like fruity versus animally versus earthy. These are kind of your interesting thiol compounds that are under the mercaptan family, but in small quantities can be very, very pleasing, or very, very unique and aromatic. And then you have your lactones and your vanillins, and this is going back to those bourbon barrels, of course, because these are both elements that are found naturally in oak. And lactones are kind of that coconut flavor. In higher concentrations, you'll definitely get a lot more coconut flavor, and it can be very overpowering. And of course, toasting of the barrel will kind of increase these elements. This is, again, if you like bourbon, you're very familiar with this flavor, because bourbon has to be aged in heavily charred new American oak. And American oak tends to have more lactones than French oak, for example, a higher volume of this coconut flavor coming out of it. But vanillin is another component that's in almost all oak, and again, will be enhanced the higher the toast quality, or the more toasted the inside of that barrel is. It just helps sort of caramelize and concentrate these things. And then outside of all these flavor compounds, what I find very fascinating is, again, all of these elements that they call flavor precursors, which are essentially the inert versions of these flavor compounds. And there are so many more of those flavor precursors in wine than there are of actual flavor compounds. And those are so important, because that's essentially the flavor potential of the wine. And these flavor precursors are what those individual chemical reactions are releasing. So inside of all of the wines and everything you're smelling, know that behind all of those aromas are 100 more aromas that are just waiting to come out and didn't have the chance, which is pretty fun. So the last two slides I have really quickly are just a little bit more about tasting, because obviously you can't talk about aroma and not talk about tasting wine. So because the idea of tasting wine can be very overwhelming and very, very intense to a lot of people, which I get, and kind of how I felt too when I first started tasting wine. What I learned, one of the first things I was taught, which I found very, very useful, is that it's much, much easier to say, no, I don't smell something, than what do I smell? And so what does that mean? This is the idea of, who here has tasted wine and been like, I don't really smell anything. I don't know what that is. Wine? Grape? Yeah, it's grape. Smells like grape. And then someone over there is like, oh, I get raspberry compote. And then you're like, oh my God, that's totally, yeah, there's raspberry. There's totally this like raspberry gelée kind of thing happening in here. And you wouldn't have thought of it if someone else hadn't said it. Everyone has had that experience. That's literally everyone's tasting experience. So what I learned early on, which I found very helpful, is that if you are the person to make the suggestion to yourself, it really helps you identify what you're smelling and tasting. So it becomes the idea of, instead of saying, what do I smell? You start to say, do I smell blank? Do I smell raspberry? Do I smell orange blossom? Do I smell clove? Right? And by kind of going through this, you get to start more easily, confidently identifying those individual factors that you can smell. Marcus has just asked if you can smell the minerality, and the answer is yes. And this is why. Kind of. So what I have on this in front of us on the slide is this idea of clusters, and these are literally the clusters that I use, and I use them consistently, and I always go through every cluster no matter what I think I smell, because some wines might seem super simple and super easy right away, but you don't really know until you start asking yourself. And so you always go through the fruit first. There's always fruit in wine, even if you don't think there is. Find some. Ask about the florals. Ask about the spice, ask about the oak, and then other, Marcus, is the category of minerality. So other is a pretty broad category, but one of the most indicative for your wines, and the most exciting, because yes, it's herbs, it's vegetalness, but it's also that earthiness. And old world wines, people who are a fan of old world wines will know this smell, because it's when you stick your nose in the glass and you smell things like dirt and mushroom, and you're like, I swear to God, I smell a garden. I smell like fertilizer in my glass right now. That's other. That's minerality. That is those elements that are not definable by your simple kind of primary esters of fruit, floral, and spice, right? And that can be really indicative of where the wine's coming from, what kind of varietal it is, and also whether or not you like it. Because you may be a person who prefers fruitiness to earthiness, or you might prefer earthiness to fruitiness. Neither one is better than the other. It's simply a matter of being able to identify and understand what you like best. So lastly, I want to leave you with this. This is probably the most wonderful companion to anyone who actually seriously wants to start kind of developing their own vernacular for wine tasting. This is the Aroma Wheel by Dr. Ann C. Noble. You can find it on the internet too, in probably a much easier readable form than what I have on the screen here. But this is essentially kind of, this was created as a guideline for potential aromas that can be found in wine. So again, when you're going through and trying to ask yourself what you smell, but you can't come up with anything to think of, just start going through these guys. It's perfectly laid out for you. So you can just kind of go all the way around the wheel and kind of find out, oh my gosh, right, prune. I didn't even think of prune. Do I smell prune? No, but hey, that's pretty cool. So that's a super fun kind of way to approach the tasting of wine and start to build your vocabulary. And don't worry about being right. Just try and really figure out what it is that you personally are smelling. When you're tasting, environment is really important. So it might sound obvious, but like, don't taste wine around other odors, because it's going to influence what you're smelling in the glass and ultimately what you're tasting. And I'm talking about tasting for evaluation, not just drinking, but you wouldn't be here if you weren't interested in tasting for evaluation. And then swirling the wine in the glass. Why do we do this? Because it volatilizes those aromas. It aerates them, and it brings all the aroma compounds closer to your face, and it lets you, it enhances your ability to identify them and appreciate them. Use your clusters, honestly, start big. The idea about the clusters is starting big. Start with fruit, break it down to color of fruit. Like, is it citrus? Is it tree fruit? Is it red fruit? Just kind of narrow it down from there. Start big and then start to narrow it down, and you'll find amazingly fast how specific you can get. And then most importantly, write out your notes clearly and consistently. So when you start a tasting practice, it is so important to literally write down everything and create an organization system that you can follow every single time. That's my clusters. And again, even if I think I don't smell anything, I still ask myself so that I don't miss anything, because by giving yourself this consistent format, it creates a habit that allows you to really have a broad scope and perspective that's specific and unique to your own individual aroma profiles. Okay, guys. Whew, that is it. That is our presentation on Aroma. So I thank you all so very, very much. That was just quite the epic one. I don't know why that felt so much more intense to me today. This was just a very intense topic, I guess. A great way to develop your aroma kind of lexicon that I talk about, going to the farmer's market, just starting to smell things. Well, you can't really right now, right? But the idea of just every time you're in the kitchen, every time you're cooking things, make a conscious effort to sit down and be like, okay, yes, I know I'm cooking spinach, but like cut the spinach, take a second to be like, what does spinach smell like? Oh, interesting. And just try and take that scent and file it back in there with herbs like chives or, you know, rosemary, juniper, things like that. You might think you know what they smell like, but try and give yourself like an olfactory kind of database, right? You want to make an imprint of it so that you can recall it when you need to, because that's really the skill that you're trying to develop, to be able to recall these aromas at a moment's notice. Okay, I'm gonna let you, I totally kept you guys long today. Thanks for staying though, I really appreciate it. I adore all of you. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. Next week, you guys, is going to be amazing. There is the Master Sommelier, Madeline Trifon, is going to join me. She is an incredible human being. She is the very first Master Sommelier, a female Master Sommelier in the United States. So she has a wealth of knowledge, and she is going to be open for questions. So we're actually going to do a lot more of kind of a question and answer, a Q&A. I encourage you guys to ask anything you want. She is so frank, and she will talk about anything. But we're going to talk a little bit about, she's going to talk about her introduction to the Court of Master Sommeliers. She's going to talk about hospitality, which is absolutely her specialty. And then again, you can ask her anything. And she's a delight, and I'll be very excited for everyone who can come. Riesling or any off-dry white will go nicely with Vietnamese food. Yes, it will. Absolutely. Was that an answer to another question? Oh, Lisa, you've even got she's way better than I am. She gave you guys a link. All right. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. I'll talk to you all next week. Thank you.